another hop, skip and a jump to the south, which to anyone not from Australia is about 1,400 kilometres and a 24-hour bus ride, we found ourselves in Adelaide. At the risk of repeating myself extensively, this city felt like a completely different world from the Red Centre and Alice Springs, which we had so recently departed. It wasn't long, however, before we started spotting a few familiar faces in these urban surroundings, not the least of which were yet more miners. In this case, the noisy miners. Considering that the adults of the species that we observed were particularly quiet, we must assume therefore that it is the juveniles that give the species its name, as this nearly fledged individual, which has for some reason shuffled out of its nest, spent the entire time we observed it pipping or squeaking more or less continuously. Eventually, one of its parents did return to see what all the fuss was about, although it didn't appear to take any other action. However, it wasn't long before we started to observe some less familiar species. One particularly notable group we observed around Adelaide were the pied kookaburra, which are closely related to the Australian magpie, and despite appearances, not closely related to corvids at all. Pied kookaburra are perhaps most notable for being one of the few bird species observed to engage in play behaviour, in which one bird perches in an exposed position and others swoop, tumble or dive in an attempt to dislodge it. Arguably though, the most distinctive bird across Australia has to be the laughing kookaburra, which are in fact the largest species of kingfisher in the world, although they are hotly contested in that title by the African giant kingfisher. The laughing kookaburra display a number of unusual adaptations and behaviours, not least of which is the fact that a breeding pair is often accompanied by up to 5 fully grown but non-breeding offspring from previous years, who will care for as yet unfledged chicks and assist in defending the nest. Laughing kookaburra typically lay 3 eggs in a nest during a breeding season. However, the smallest hatchling will typically be killed by its nestmates in order to reduce competition for resources. In contrast, when they do fledge, the group as a collective will care for fledglings for up to 10 weeks until they're able to forage independently. What sets Adelaide apart, however, from Darwin and Alice Springs is the waterbird population. In contrast with the desert or tropical savanna climates available across the Northern Territory, Adelaide is classified as a hot Mediterranean climate. The reservoirs and waterways that support the city are home to a fabulous selection of waterbirds, many of which can be found only in Australia. One example of this is the Australian wood duck, which is supposedly so named for its habit of perching on logs or trees, although the name may also refer to their habit of nesting within a tree cavity, from which the ducklings will leap far before they're capable of flight, once they're ready to leave the nest. Another unusual species that may be found across Australia is the white-eyed duck, which is more commonly known as the hardhead. The only true diving duck in Australia, it gets its name not from having a particularly dense cranium, but instead from the challenges faced by early taxidermists when attempting to process the head for display. And in keeping with the theme of naming, here we have a Pacific black duck. We were fortunate enough to observe all of these species on a single stretch of waterway, along with several others besides. And despite the fact that normally these species would be non-competitive with one another, of course, human interactions does tend to change this. In this particular instance, a coot has managed to get a faceful of what appears to be stale bread that it is unable to swallow as it's slightly too large. The rest of the birds on the waterway, and indeed a nearby crow, then chase the poor coot, making their displeasure quite vocally known. A close relative of the Eurasian coot, which is likely what was seen in the last clip, although one unlikely to be bullied on the waterways in the same fashion, is the Australasian swamp hen. About 1/4 again as large and half again the weight of their smaller cousins, the Australasian swamp hen, as one might expect, is not a particularly strong flyer and tends to walk away from danger rather than escape by air. The final bird we observed along the waterways of Adelaide is another Australian icon, although in this instance, perhaps one they might prefer had not gained such international fame. The Australian white ibis is closely related to, and indeed closely resembles, the African sacred ibis, but despite urban legends, is not a feral species introduced to Australia, but is in fact a native bird species. Historically rare in urban areas, the Australian white ibis has become quite well established in many cities since the 1970s, and now have almost completely abandoned natural breeding areas across New South Wales, with populations residing almost entirely in and around cities. As is often the case with highly successful urbanisations like this, the Australian white ibis has developed a habit of rummaging in garbage, leading to the species becoming colloquially known and perhaps internationally infamous as the bin chicken. Our final spot in Adelaide is another aquatic species, although this time not a bird, and frankly not one we were expecting to observe at all. Currently generally known as the Australasian fur seal, they are generally referred to in Australia as the long-nosed fur seal. And unlike true seals, they have visible external ears and hind flippers that can rotate forwards. We were extraordinarily fortunate to observe this individual as close to Adelaide as we did, as typically, during the time of year we were visiting, they would be found further offshore hunting for prey. Fortunately for us, however, the variable weather conditions had driven a shoal, so a number of humans, and indeed this fur seal, were taking advantage of this to do a spot of fishing. Long-nosed fur seals are able to dive deeper and longer than any other species of fur seal, with the females getting down for about 9 minutes to a depth of 312 metres at their deepest, and males can dive for up to 15 minutes to a depth of around 380 metres. However, the coastal waters around Adelaide are very shallow, and this individual we observed being underwater for at most a minute or two at a time before surfacing again. Despite appearing quite gentle and playful, an adult male long-nosed fur seal may be up to 160 kilograms, and their agility in the water implies that they have a fairly significant amount of strength. Although it is not believed they pose any threat to humans, for everyone's safety, including the fur seals, the beach was closed when this individual arrived. This meant that the only obstruction to filming it was the pier on which we stood, and the occasional fishing line. Eventually, our unexpected subject decided that they'd had enough, and dove beyond the range of our cameras to track with any reliability before disappearing out to sea.